When three countries, all armed with nuclear weapons, are enemies, words should be chosen carefully. Something India's army chief learned last week when he said, "We have to be prepared. In our context, warfare lies within the realm of reality." A threatening thought in the latest diplomatic drama between India and China that began in a remote region of the Himalayas. The two nations have shared a 4,000-kilometre border for years, but it's an 89 square kilometre area called the Doklam Plateau that's creating strife. China has been trying to get its hands on Doklam for 20 years. It didn't work, so in June its troops began building a road through the plateau in preparation for military manoeuvres in the future. But they were confronted by their Indian counterparts, who knew that any encroachment of this land would make their country vulnerable. China and India have a long history with their long border. In 1962, they went to battle over another part of the crossing. Those old war wounds were reopened in India, with protesters taking to the streets of New Delhi. But after more than 70 days, it seems that both sides have realised what's at stake and have toned down their language at least. General Rawat also rode back on his original comments, saying neither China nor Pakistan are a threat. But while politically peace may have been restored, protests have continued in cities across India, with demonstrators burning products made in China, as well as demanding ties be severed. And while the standoff has been stood down, it has raised important questions about how close to the brink of war the region lies. Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined now from Tel Aviv by Ashok Mehta, a retired Indian Army general from the Gurkha Regiment. From Washington, D.C., Saurabh Gupta. He's a security analyst and senior fellow at the Institute for China-America Studies. And from Islamabad, Maria Sultan. She's the Director General of the South Asian Strategic Stability Institute University. Thanks all of you for joining us. General Ashok Mehta, let me begin with you, sir. Is the previously unthinkable now a possibility that India and China might go to war?
No, I don't think that is a possibility at all. Both India and China realize that war between these two countries will be catastrophic, not just for the two countries, but for the immediate neighborhood as well as all of Asia, if not the rest of the world. So I think what the Chinese barrage of threats and daily verbiage of what they call their theory of warfare, that is media, psychological, as well as what they call the three warfare strategy, and the use of their think tanks, their media. I think all that created an atmosphere that people thought, especially people who were not acquainted with the strategic situation, that such threats could lead to war.
Okay, certainly.
I used to be asked every morning when I was on my walk.
Okay, and I apologize for interrupting you, because I have to keep moving this on. But the Chinese, you say the Chinese are creating an atmosphere. The Chinese didn't put words in the mouth of the army chief when he said war is very much in the realm of reality. This is the Indian army chief. This is not China. Why did he say it if it's completely off the table and there's zero chance?
No. You see, this has been pulled completely out of context. The army chief did not make this statement during the 73 days of the standoff. This statement was made after the standoff had been defused. He was speaking at a seminar where a philosophical question arose about warfare. And in the warfare theory, he said it is possible that India could face a two-front scenario. In other words, India would engage both with China and with Pakistan. Now, he did not specify these countries, but he did not say this is going to happen.
Okay.
He said this is a possibility.
Okay, so your reading of it is different.
This is not something new.
Okay, fair enough. Fair enough.
This has been said previously.
Understood. Yes, he called them the northern adversary and the western adversary, so referring to China and to Pakistan. Let me bring in Saurabh Gupta. Saurabh Gupta, where are we right now? Is it a dangerous situation, or is it not as bad as people think, as we're hearing from the general? How do you read it, Saurabh?
I would put it somewhere in the middle. It is the situation is not going to break out into war anytime soon. And at the same time, even though there are very good confidence-building measures and crisis management mechanisms on the boundary, the situation is becoming tenser gradually. Over the past 3 or 4 years, we've had a number of standoffs on the border. The previous standoffs were diffused more easily because overall bilateral ties were fairly good. But since the incoming of the Modi administration, those ties have slipped, which makes management of border issues difficult. The main problem we are having out here is that the Chinese positioning of forces was some distance from the boundary, while India's positioning was fairly close to the boundary because they feel they have terrain disadvantages. The Chinese have asked the Indians to go back a little bit so that they are not so close, they don't oppose each other so closely, and that there are not that many light fortifications which are built on the boundary line.
Saurabh, we're talking about what the Indian Army chief calls salami slicing, meaning that the Chinese are not moving in their territory. They're moving in territory that the Indians say is their territory, right? So, okay, I don't want to get into a border dispute here, but the fact that that the Indians see it as their own land that's being encroached upon, this is why they feel they need to take contingency measures. Can you understand that from the Indian perspective, Saurabh?
I absolutely can understand that from the Indian perspective, and I can understand troops patrolling right up to their interpretation of the border, of the boundary. The point of the matter is that the forces which are behind them need to be at some distance from the boundary so that there's not that much tension on the boundary. Right. That's number one. Second, both countries need to respect each other's sensitivities in sensitive areas by not building light fortifications right abutting the boundary. India has done that a bit too often, and China had asked India to not to build fortifications so close. It's been met with deaf ears. So the Chinese now have started building their light fortifications and their roads very close to the boundary, and this is creating tensions. Right. Okay. And therefore, I think what they need to do is find ways to just separate themselves a little more, while at the same time continuing their foot patrols right up to their interpretation of the boundary line.
Yeah, can they separate themselves up in the Himalayas? Maria Sultan, from the Pakistani perspective, when you witness this 10-week-long standoff in Doklam, and then afterwards the Indian Army chief says that India needs to be prepared for a two-front war against both Pakistan and China, how do the Pakistanis react to that, and how do they see this situation moving forward?
Actually, as far as Islamabad is concerned, we see this as quite a disturbing factor, which has now become what the Indian military calls the new normal, where they want to activate the borders, where they want to believe that by escalating tensions on the borders, they can pretty much achieve their military or strategic objectives. Unfortunately, the fact is this, that such kind of maneuvers and such kind of military, high-sounding objectives can be counterproductive in an environment where there is literally no trust, whether it is between Pakistan and India, whether it is between China and India. Furthermore, the fact is this, that military maneuvers by the border security forces, or for that matter, infantry divisions, or for that matter, light combat divisions, which are close to the China-India border, or for that matter, the ones which are closer to Pakistani line of control, such maneuvers cannot be separated. It is no longer a position where they can carry out such activities in another country or another territory and believe that there would be no counter response. There is a greater possibility of miscalculation, there is a greater possibility of war, and the reality is that the Indian military high command, as well as the Indian political leadership, has not brought back this home back to their own people, or for that matter to the international community, that it is actually willing to fight a nuclear war between two countries which are actually nuclear capable.
Right.
So once you start the war, you have the right to initiate it, but you do not have the right to control it. So this is very dangerous brinksmanship. And furthermore, in the case of Doklam, they are even dealing with Burmese territory. So it's not even just a question of bilateral issue, it's a trilateral issue which they're dealing with, not only on the border grounds, but also in terms of whether or not they can substantiate it with additional troops or additional war masking. What if the two sides decide to take one step further? What would be India's response? Will they be able to come up with reverse engineering? Would they be able to actually mobilize that much? Are they ready for a total war? I don't think so.
Okay,
so these are dangerous calculations, and they're very destabilizing for the region.
Fair enough, and emphatically put. Let me bring in General Ashok Mehta. And of course, we're not forgetting small Bhutan, which is also in the mix because of its geography. But as Maria said, General, we look at the situation, and any sort of escalation on the border increases the chances of miscalculation. Can you say that this current administration in India isn't gambling a little bit here? We have 3 nuclear-armed countries involved, almost 3 billion people involved, and there's a possibility that something could go wrong, and we're increasing the risk here. Would you accept that the risk has been increased in the past few months?
No, not at all. From India's point of view, the government of India behaved impeccably, perfectly. The very first statement, the only statement that was made by the government of India, which was through a press release on 30th of June, talked about peace and stability. The External Affairs Minister of the Government of India in Parliament a few days later had said that we want peace, we do not want war, and it was in fact the Chinese who had escalated the situation by coming into Doklam. Doklam is disputed territory. It is disputed between Bhutan and China, and the Chinese thought, because Bhutan is a tiny country, they could bulldoze their way through the Doklam disputed territory to a tri-junction between India, Bhutan, and China, which is also disputed. And the government of India has cited in the press release and in the statements in Parliament, which have not been disputed by the Chinese government, about these disputes.
Okay,
the
so
fact
let me...
that tri-junction is under dispute.
Let me ask, General, let's bring in Maria.
So let me just finish.
Okay, very briefly, sir, please.
No, I have not finished.
General, I think...
Okay, finish your point, sir.
The escalation the escalation is not from India's point of view. It was the Chinese government of India, never at any stage, when Mariam talks about the new normal is the reference to such situations arising on the India-China border, because the India-China border has not been demarcated.
Okay, I need to get the others in here, General. General, I need to give the others a chance. Okay,
and
Maria Sultan, come in.
The country is also involved.
Certainly.
And
you made the point, sir. Maria, come in.
Situation.
Yeah. General, I just want to say this, that if you make a road and if you amass military troops on the other side, it's not considered as non-provoking, number one. Number two, if you talk about a tri-junction, which definitely is not Indian territory in the same realm, then of course it would be seen as a provocation for a third party interfering in a bilateral issue where it doesn't actually stand a chance, where it doesn't even actually have a claim. And if it is contested, then it means it goes on. And furthermore, building a road is not equal to amassing troops. So there is a big debate in terms of who provoked what. But leaving aside that, the fact remains you can initiate a military maneuver. But the right of the other party, whether it is China or Pakistan, how to counter-response that or how to come up with a counter-response would be determined by how they view the threat. It would not be the framework in which you see violence or in which India sees or frames this contest, but it would be how it is perceived on the other end. And unfortunately, the new normal of activating the line of controls or activating the border security formations is highly destabilizing and highly provoking, and it can lead to counter-response, which perhaps New Delhi is not yet prepared to actually anticipate or even come up with a counter-action.
Saurabh, would you agree that both India and China are being provocative here?
There's blame to go on both sides. Let me get a little to the backstory of how I sense that this episode came about. For the past 9 months before the standoff, India has been basically poking China in the eye on the Tibet issue. It allowed the head of the Tibetan government in exile to have dinner with the U.S. ambassador. The U.S. ambassador went to the disputed territory, which India and China dispute, and basically brought the whole Tibet issue right to the forefront of India-China ties and poked China's eyes. And hope that this would be a new normal and China would just accept it. It came to a point at which China just got a little fed up and realized and decided that it would once again bring boundary realities to the forefront of China-India relations, because that is one of the means by which New Delhi begins to understand the gravity of the situation in its political relationship with China. And therefore, China built this road in the Doklam area, which is a road of very marginal military value to China, because China is at severe tactical disadvantage in that area. It did this as a political statement, but it did this as a political statement because both parties have been building roads and light fortifications very close to the boundary and kind of skirmishing with each other. And so there is this backstory which shows that neither party has very clean hands on this, but it also goes to show that both parties need to first have better crisis management mechanisms on the boundary. They're good mechanisms, but they need to create greater separation. And secondly, and this is actually a story, this is something India needs to internalize a little better. The China-India relationship is a very important relationship, and it needs to be treated as such. And therefore, I mean, this business of eye-poking using Tibet just for pure small political gains, petty political gains, is not really worthwhile or useful.
Okay, let me give the General the final word then. General Ashok Mehta, is it in India's interest to have better relations with China?
I think yes, certainly, but I think my Indian colleague is factually wrong and strategic interpretationally wrong on two issues. Tibet, the Tibet issue, this is not a minor issue or for petty gains. The road was being made to a point called Gimochen. Gimochen is the disputed tri-junction. From Gimochen, the Chinese enjoy a terrific strategic advantage. Why do you think otherwise they were building this road? Of course, they were attempting to build this road because they thought this was Bhutanese territory and that India, which has a defense relationship with Bhutan, would not intervene. But India did intervene on third country soil to tell the Chinese that enough is enough, that you cannot do this because we have written agreements about the tri-junction, we have written agreements on the Sikkim border, you're quoting 1890 convention, well, there are other conventions and there are other agreements on a standstill. So I think finally the Chinese realized, after all the threats that they had issued, to agree to defuse for reasons that were very important for President Xi Jinping. One was the BRICS summit. The second is the 19th CPC, the Central Party Committee, the meeting which is going to be held next month. These two issues trumped what the Chinese PLA, and by the way, the Chinese PLA commander, the Joint Chief of Staff, General Fa Feng, who was removed on that very day when the diffusion took place. So it appears to me that the Chinese PLA commander was reluctant to withdraw from Doklam. And this is now something that is out in the Chinese media also. They do not say that he was reluctant to pull out, but he was removed on the very day, 28th of August, when this diffusion took place.
And those issues might be connected, certainly. But I'd like to have the Chinese on to defend themselves
peacefully.
But okay, I've got to wrap, unfortunately. I have to move on in the program, but it's been a pleasure talking to all of you. General Ashok Mehta, Saurabh Gupta and Maria Sultan.
Thank you.
I thank you all for joining us on the Newsmakers.